The lecture hall at Dunmore University smelled the way all old buildings do when winter settles in: radiator heat, chalk dust, and something faintly institutional, like paper that has been read too many times. It was a Wednesday in late November, and outside the tall windows the sky had gone the color of old pewter. Gerald Sutton was mopping the third corridor when he heard it. Not an argument exactly, more like a challenge. The kind that hangs in the air after it has been spoken and makes everyone in the room hold very still. He paused with the mop handle resting against his shoulder and listened through the open door at the end of the hall. "I have been presenting this problem to graduate students for 11 years, said the voice from inside the lecture theater. 11 years, and not one of them, not one, has produced a complete and valid proof. So I will make the same offer I make every November. Whoever solves it by the end of this session will receive an automatic exemption from the final examination and a letter of commendation from this department." There was a ripple of sound, chairs shifting, a few low murmurs. "Take your time," said the voice. "Study it." Gerald leaned the mop against the wall and moved a little closer to the doorway. He was not supposed to be in this corridor until 7, but the floor buffer on the east wing had broken again, and arrangements had sent him here early. He was wearing his gray coveralls, the ones with the small rip at the left knee that he kept forgetting to mend, and his boots left faint damp prints on the tile behind him. Through the narrow window in the door he could see the lecture theater. Tiered seating, about 60 students, mostly in their 20s, laptops open, some with printed notes spread across their desks. At the front, beside a long whiteboard covered in dense mathematical notation, stood a woman in a dark blazer. She was perhaps 55, silver-haired, with the kind of posture that suggested she had spent decades standing in front of rooms and expected them to pay attention. A small placard on the podium read, "Dr. Carolyn Mace, Department of Mathematics." Gerald looked at the board. He looked at it for a long time. The problem was a proof in functional analysis, a boundary condition problem that most working mathematicians would recognize immediately as a cousin of certain open questions in spectral theory. It was elegant in the way that very difficult things sometimes are, compact in its statement, enormous in its implications. Someone had written it out in 3 parts, each building on the one before, and at the third step there was a gap, not an error, exactly, but an incompleteness, a place where the logic strained at the seams. Gerald had seen a version of this problem before. A long time ago, in a different life. He pushed the door open quietly and stepped inside. No one turned. The students were bent over their notes, and Dr. Mace had her back to the room, adding a clarifying notation to the upper right corner of the board. Gerald moved to the far side of the room, near the wall where the cleaning cart usually parked, and he stood there with his hands at his sides and read the problem from beginning to end. When he finished reading, he stood still for a moment. Then he reached into the breast pocket of his coveralls and found the pen he always kept there, a plain black ballpoint, the kind that costs $1.50 for a pack of 10. He uncapped it. He looked at the board. He looked at the gap in the third section of the proof. He walked to the front of the room. Afterward, several students would disagree about exactly what happened next. One would say that no one noticed him approach. Another would say that the room went quiet before he even reached the board, as though something in the air had changed. What everyone agreed on was that when Dr. Carolyn Mace turned around and found a maintenance worker standing beside her whiteboard with a pen in his hand, her expression passed through 3 distinct stages in the space of about 2 seconds. Surprise, irritation, composure. "Can I help you?" she said. Her voice was careful. "There's an error in the third step," Gerald said. He said it, the way someone might say there's a crack in the baseboard, as a simple observation, without particular force behind it. The room went very quiet. Dr. Mace looked at him. She looked at the board. She looked back at him. "Excuse me?" "The transition between the second and third conditions," Gerald said. "The bound you've established doesn't hold under the assumption you've carried forward from the first part. You've treated the domain as compact when the problem statement doesn't guarantee it. The proof doesn't close." Someone in the 4th row let out a short breath of laughter, then stopped. Dr. Mace did not laugh. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite anger and not quite curiosity, something caught between the two. "And you are Gerald Sutton, Building Services." He touched the badge clipped to his chest. "I'm early tonight. East wing buffer's down." A student near the back whispered something to her neighbor. Another opened his phone and held it below the desk. "Mr. Sutton," Dr. Mace said, and her voice had the measured quality of someone choosing their words with professional care. "This is a graduate-level proof that doctoral candidates have been unable to complete. I appreciate if you'll let me use the board," Gerald said. "I can show you where it fails, and I can show you how to correct it." The room held its breath. Dr. Mace was quiet for a long moment. There was something in her stillness that was not dismissal. She was looking at his face, and whatever she found there made her pause in a way that her institutional instincts might otherwise have prevented. She stepped to the side. "Then show me," she said. What happened over the next 34 minutes, Gerald would not be able to describe very well afterward, because he did not experience it the way the room experienced it. For the students watching, it was like watching someone dismantle a locked box with a hairpin. Slow, precise, almost casual, each movement so deliberate that you couldn't be sure whether you were watching skill or luck until the box was open. For Dr. Mace, standing 5 feet away with her arms folded, it was something else entirely. Gerald worked from left to right, filling in the space the original proof had left open. His handwriting was not elegant. It was the handwriting of someone who had spent years writing quickly in margins and on the backs of envelopes, but the logic was clean. He rebuilt the boundary condition from the ground up, drew in the step that the original statement had elided, and then carried it through to a close that was, Dr. Mace would later write in her notes, airtight. He put the cap back on his pen when he was done. "That's one way to close it," he said. "There's another, but it's less direct." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Dr. Mace walked to the board and stood in front of what Gerald had written. She read it in silence. She went back to the beginning and read it again. "Where?" she said, and her voice had changed. The careful professional register was still there, but under it something had shifted. "Did you study?" Gerald looked at the floor for a moment. It was the question he had known was coming, and even now, after all this time, it still landed somewhere tender. "University of Waterloo," he said. "Mathematics. I left in my 3rd year." "Left," she repeated. "My wife was diagnosed in October of that year. Stage 3. We had a daughter. She was 2. He paused. "I left to take care of them. I worked nights so I could be home during the day." The room was completely silent, not the held breath silence of before, but a different kind, the kind that settles over a space when something real has entered it. "Your wife," Dr. Mace said carefully. "She died," Gerald said. 8 years ago." He said it without drama. He had had a long time to learn how to say it that way. "My daughter is finishing her undergraduate degree now," he added. "Science. She's good." There was something in his voice when he said that, not pride exactly, or not only pride, but a kind of quiet amazement, as though he still could not quite believe that this part of the story had gone the way it had. He picked up his pen and tucked it back into his breast pocket. "I should get back," he said. "East Wing won't do itself." He was in the corridor, pulling his cart from the alcove near the stairwell, when he heard the door of the lecture theater open behind him. "Mr. Sutton," he turned. Dr. Carolyn Mace was standing in the doorway, and she was holding a notepad in her hand. Behind her, through the open door, he could see the lecture hall still full of students, most of them turned in their seats to watch. "Your proof," she said. She held up the notepad, on which she had transcribed what he had written on the board. "I'd like to have it reviewed. Formally." "It'll hold," Gerald said. "I believe you," she said, and she said it like someone who did not give that particular sentence out carelessly. "I would also like to speak with you about something else if you're willing." He waited. "This department has a seminar series," she said. "Guest lectures, visiting researchers. We've had Fields Medal recipients, department heads, retired professors with decades of publications behind them." She paused. "We have never had a guest from building services." Gerald looked at her for a moment. "I clean floors," he said. It was not a deflection. It was the plainest true thing he could think of to say. "You also just completed a proof that my best doctoral students have been attempting unsuccessfully for 3 years," Dr. Mace said. "Both things can be true." He looked down at his cart. The mop handle was slightly crooked, and the wheel on the left side pulled to the right, and he had been meaning to ask arrangements to replace it for 2 months. He was aware that he was thinking about this as a way of not thinking about what Dr. Mace was saying to him. "I'd need to think about it," he said. "Of course." She pulled a card from the notepad and held it out to him. Take whatever time you need." He took the card. He stood there for a moment holding it, and then he tucked it into the same pocket as the pen. "Thank you," he said. "No," she said, and she looked at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded, in a way that Gerald suspected was not her natural state. "Thank you." He finished the East Wing at 9:10. The buffer had been replaced finally by a younger colleague who had arrived at 7 with a replacement unit and a mildly apologetic expression, and the floor came up to a clean shine under the machine's slow passage. Gerald worked the corners by hand, the way he always did, because the machine could not reach into the angles properly, and he had a particular dislike of corners that had been neglected. He thought about the lecture hall. He had not planned to go in. He had not planned any of it. The open door, the problem on the board, the pen in his pocket. He had simply seen something that was not right and said so. It was the same impulse that made him repair the loose handrail on the east staircase 6 months before facilities had gotten around to noting it on their maintenance schedule, and the same impulse that had, 22 years ago, made him put his hand up in a third-year seminar and point out the gap in a visiting lecturer's argument about metric space completions. He had been 23 then. He had been good, not brilliant. He had never believed himself to be brilliant, but good in the way that mattered more, the patient, thorough kind of good that could sit with a problem for as long as the problem required. Then October had come, and with it the oncologist's office on the 4th floor of a building he could no longer walk past without his chest going tight, and everything had reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. He did not regret it. He wanted to be clear about that, even if only to himself in the fluorescent quiet of the East Wing corridor at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night. He did not regret it. He had been given a choice between two things and he had chosen the right one, and the fact that it had cost him something did not change the nature of the choice. His daughter was 24. Her name was Nora. Not in the file, not in any of the stories he carried around inside him like river stones, smooth and present, and she was in her final year of biochemistry at McGill, and she had her mother's laugh and his stubbornness, and she was, as he had said to Dr. Mace in the lecture hall without quite being able to stop himself, good. He turned off the buffer and stood in the empty corridor. The card from Dr. Mace was in his pocket. He could feel the slight thickness of it through the fabric. He thought about what she had said. Both things can be true. He called Nora on the way home. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she was still awake, which meant she was working, which was almost always the case on Wednesday nights. "Dad, you up?" "Lab report due Friday." "What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong," he said. He was walking. The university was 20 minutes from his apartment on foot, and he almost always walked, because the city at night had a particular quality he liked, the way the street lights made halos in the cold air and the sidewalks were mostly clear of people. "Something happened at work tonight," he told her. He tried to keep it brief and factual the way he told stories, but she interrupted him twice. Once to ask about the specific proof, and once, when he got to the part about Dr. Mace coming into the corridor, to say quietly, "Dad, she gave me a card," he said, "about a seminar series." Silence on the line for a moment. "Are you going to call her?" "I don't know, Dad." And this time the word carried everything she wasn't quite able to say out loud. The years of watching him come home from night shifts, the lunches he had packed for her in the years when she was small, the way he had sat with her at the kitchen table every evening before he left for work and helped her with whatever she was struggling with, patient and unhurried as though time were not the constant scarcity it actually was. "You should call her." He stopped walking for a moment. The street was quiet. The light from a pharmacy window cast a rectangle of yellow-white across the sidewalk in front of him, and somewhere down the block a dog was barking at something with the kind of persistent conviction that suggested it was not going to stop anytime soon. "Go finish your lab report," he said. "I'm just saying, I know what you're saying." "She heard you," Nora said. "That professor. She actually heard you. You should let people hear you, Dad. You're allowed." He stood there on the sidewalk in the cold for a long moment after they hung up, with his hands in his pockets and the card from Dr. Mace pressing against his palm. He had spent a long time being unheard. Not bitterly. He was not a bitter man, and he had made his choices with open eyes, but simply as a fact of the life he had built around the people who needed him. The overnight shifts, the early mornings, the gradual accumulation of small invisibilities that come from wearing a uniform and pushing a cart through corridors where no one looks up from their phones. He had not resented it. He had understood it as the shape his life had taken, and he had carried it without complaint, because complaint was not in his nature, and because, more practically, it would not have helped. But he was 51 years old. Nora was almost finished her degree. The apartment was quiet in a way it had not always been, and the evening stretched in a way he was still getting used to. He had a pen in his pocket and a card in his hand, and a proof on a whiteboard in a lecture hall that would still be there tomorrow morning, in his handwriting, in a room full of people who had watched him write it. He started walking again. He called Dr. Mace's number the following Monday. She answered on the third ring, and when he told her who he was calling, she said, "Mr. Sutton, I was hoping you would," with a directness that he appreciated. They spoke for 40 minutes. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, and she told him about the seminar series, that it ran 6 times a year, that the format was informal by academic standards, that she would like him to present the corrected proof and discuss the approach he had used, and wherever that approach led, because in her view it opened onto something that her department had been circling around for 2 years without quite arriving at. "I'm not an academic," he said. "I left in my 3rd year. You are aware," she said, "that the proof you wrote on my board is, to my knowledge, original." He was quiet for a moment. "There might be something similar in the literature," he said. "I don't have current access." "I've looked," she said. "There isn't. Not the way you've approached it." He turned his coffee cup slowly on the table. "The seminar isn't about credentials," Dr. Mace continued. "It's about thinking, about what happens when someone who has actually sat with a problem for long enough tells a room of people what they found." She paused. "You sat with that problem for however many years. I'd like the room to hear what you found." He said he would think about it. He did not take very long. The seminar was on a Thursday evening in January 5 weeks later. Dr. Mace had arranged it without much fanfare, a notice in the department newsletter, an email to faculty and graduate students, nothing that would make it a spectacle before it had a chance to be anything else. Gerald drove himself. He had a 12-year-old Honda Civic, the color of old concrete that he had owned since Nora was in middle school, and he sat in the parking lot for a few minutes before going inside, listening to the engine tick in the cold. He was wearing his good jacket. It was not a remarkable jacket, dark wool, somewhat worn at the cuffs, but it was the one he wore to Nora's convocations and to the Christmas Mass he attended every year at the church 3 blocks from his apartment, and it seemed right for the occasion. Inside the building, a graduate student he didn't recognize held the door for him. He thanked her. She said, "Are you here for the seminar?" And when he said yes, she said, "It's on the 3rd floor. The notices said 3rd floor, but it's actually on the 2nd. The signs will take you the wrong way," and he said he'd remember that. He found the room without difficulty. It was not the main lecture theater, but a smaller space, horseshoe-shaped, with about 30 seats, and when he arrived most of them were full. He recognized a few faces from the November night. The student who had laughed, who now looked distinctly uncomfortable. The young woman who had opened her phone below the desk, who had since looked him up online and found almost nothing, because Gerald was not a person who existed much on the internet. Dr. Mace was at the front. When she saw him come in, she gave a brief nod. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, when he had settled at the small table she had set up at the front of the room, "this is Gerald Sutton. He works in building services at this university, which means most of you have walked past him in a corridor at some point without particular notice. That's all right. I had the same tendency until 5 weeks ago." She paused. "On the 22nd of November, Mr. Sutton walked into my graduate seminar during his shift and completed a proof that this department has been attempting unsuccessfully for 3 years. Tonight he's going to talk about how he did it, and I would ask you to bring your full attention." She sat down. The room was quiet. Gerald looked at the whiteboard. He looked at the 30 faces arranged in a horseshoe around him. He thought about Nora at her kitchen table in Montreal, working on her lab report. He thought about his wife. Her name had been Louise Ellen Sutton née Abernethy, and she had had the kind of mind that moved sideways through problems instead of straight at them, which was a quality Gerald had always admired and still sometimes heard in his own thinking, like a frequency he had tuned to so long ago that he had stopped noticing it. He picked up the marker. "The problem as it was originally stated," he said, "has a hidden assumption in it. The assumption isn't wrong, exactly, but it's incomplete, and when you try to build the third condition on top of it, the foundation shifts. What I want to show you is where it shifts, and why, and what you can put in its place to keep the structure standing." He wrote the first line. "It starts here," he said. He spoke for 50 minutes. The questions afterward went on for another 40. Dr. Mace sat at the side of the room and said almost nothing because the room did not need her to. There was a graduate student in the second row, a young man named Daniel, who was doing his doctorate on a problem in operator theory, who kept going very still at certain moments, the way people go still when they hear something that connects to something they have been working on in private, and when the formal session ended, he came forward with his notebook already open. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "Sure," Gerald said. They talked for 20 minutes in the emptying room. When Daniel left, he left quickly, with the focused expression of a person who had somewhere important to be. Dr. Mace came over and stood beside the whiteboard where Gerald's work still covered most of the surface. "How are you feeling?" she asked. He thought about it for a moment. "Good," he said. "Strange, but good." She nodded slowly. "There's something I want to ask you, and I want you to know there's no pressure. You can say no and it changes nothing about my respect for what you've done here tonight." He waited. "The department has a position," she said. "A non-teaching research associate. Part-time. It doesn't require a degree. We can waive the credential requirement under academic discretion, and I have the authority to do that. It would involve working with our graduate students on an informal basis, reviewing their problems, offering perspective. It would not require you to leave your current position unless you wish to." She paused. "It would also give you library access, journal subscriptions, a workspace if you wanted one." Gerald looked at the whiteboard. He thought about the night of November 22nd and the smell of floor wax and old radiators, and the way the problem had looked through the narrow window in the lecture hall door. Urgent and imperfect and waiting. He thought about Nora. "You're allowed." "I'll think about it," he said. Dr. Mace smiled briefly. "You said that the last time. I called," he pointed out. "You did," she said. He accepted the position on the 2nd of February. He kept his maintenance job. He worked nights 3 days a week and spent Thursday and Friday mornings in a small office on the 2nd floor of the mathematics building that smelled of old carpet and had a window that looked out over the parking lot, and he read journals and worked through problems and occasionally knocked on the open door of a doctoral student's office and said, very mildly, "I think there might be an issue with the third step." Nora drove down from Montreal in March when her reading week aligned with the day he had free, and they had dinner at the kitchen table the way they always had, with the overhead light that was slightly too bright, and the drawer that didn't quite close, and the particular quiet of a home that had held a great deal and settled into itself. She asked him about the position. He described it with characteristic understatement, which she had grown up translating, and she listened with her chin in her hand and her mother's particular quality of attention. "Are you happy?" she asked when he had finished. He thought about it seriously, which was the only way he knew how to think about things. "I think so," he said. "Yes." She reached across the table and put her hand briefly over his, and then she picked up her fork again. "Good," she said. "You deserve it." He would have argued with her about the word deserve, because he had complicated feelings about that word and what it implied about the way the world distributed its goods. But she knew that about him, and she said it anyway, which was one of the things he loved most about her. The fact that she held her own view and stated it plainly and let him disagree, because she had learned early that disagreement in their house was not the same thing as distance. He did not argue. He looked at his daughter across the table, at the particular shape of her face that was her mother's and her own and no one else's, and he thought about the long route that had brought them both to this kitchen, this table, this ordinary evening in early March. He thought, "It is enough. It is more than enough." And then Nora said something about her thesis advisor, and he laughed, and the moment settled into the meal like all the other moments had, one by one, until the evening was full of them.